Thank you for being here. We have a few announcements tonight. Tonight, for ladies, in the Sparkle Conference that will be here at Ray of Hope, July 28th, 29th, coming up about 2 weeks, Friday and Saturday. Tonight is the last day to order your t-shirt for you order a size. I think you can buy one later, but there's no guarantee it'll be the size you want. So if you, there's a table out in front, you can do that. And Friday evening, if you're a volunteer for the Sparkle Conference, there's a Sparkle Conference volunteer rally here at the church Friday evening. Men, here's one for you men. Saturday morning here at our fellowship hall is our quarterly men's breakfast that we have here at the fellowship hall. On the other months, we have one at Jimmy's Egg, but on every quarter, we have one here where we all gather on Saturday morning. It's at 8 o'clock. So would like you all to come to that. That's usually very well attended and very worthwhile. And then next week at Ray of Hope, we have Vacation Bible School. So I'm sure there is a sign-up sheet for volunteers if you would like to come help us on that. And I think that's enough announcements for one night. That'll get us through the next week, right? Anyway, nice to be part of an active church that's interested in spreading the kingdom. Let's give thanks now for our offering. Thank you, Lord, for letting us come together tonight and fellowship, study your word, and just, Father, enjoy being your children. Father, it's a blessing, tremendous, tremendous blessing above all else to be part of your kingdom. Father, thank you for our freedoms that we can come together, that we don't have to worry about persecution. Thank you for this lovely building that we have where we can comfortably study your word. But above all, Father, thank you for the life that we have, the hope that we have, and that we know that one day we'll be with you. Thank you in your Son's name. Amen. If you don't have a lesson, raise your hand, and Ricky will get you one from the back so you can follow along with us. This is lesson number 7 in this series. Every other Wednesday we do this, and we call this Disruptive Discipleship, how we can be better disciples. But to do that, first we have to disrupt some of the old habits, old things that are in our lives. So we always start out with the definitions of disrupt and disciple. To disrupt means to prevent a process from continuing as usual, to force change. Because if you don't force change, change will not happen. So we can say we want to be a better person, we want to be more spiritual, we want to be a better disciple, but if nothing changes, that's just words. We've got to force a change. A disciple, we've said in the past, the disciple is not just a student. I promise you the enemy knows the Bible better than you or I do, but he's not a disciple. So just knowing the Bible does not make you a disciple. A disciple actively imitates the life and teachings of the Master. This is a deliberate apprenticeship which makes the fully formed disciple a living copy of the Master. So that is our goal. We're not just trying to be church members. We're not trying to be social Christians. We want to be disciples because it's disciples that change the world. So this is our 7th lesson using the book of Judges, going through the book of Judges, taking out some of the stories and using those as kind of a launching pad for looking at ways we can be disruptive disciples. The book of Judges, as we've said before, in the Hebrew Bible is called the deliverers. So it's not like they're in black robes up on a stand, but rather they are delivering Israel from their enemies. They're in the Promised Land, so the book of Judges covers about 400 years between the death of Joshua, which ends the book of Joshua, and before the 1 Samuel starts. 1 Samuel begins the life of Samuel, the last judge, and then King Saul, and then starts with King David. So there's 400 years. And there's a cycle that keeps happening. As you read the book of Judges, the Israelites are in the promised land, but they really haven't done what God told them to do, which was to totally annihilate all of the inhabitants to get rid of the idol worshipers, because God knew that would be a temptation to them. And so what happens is you see this cycle throughout the book of Judges where the children of Israel will be in obedience to God, they'll be worshiping God, they'll be conquering the enemies, and then, through the generations they start falling away and start worshiping the idols of the people around them because they never really totally annihilate them. So then God allows them to be overcome by their enemies, so they're basically in slavery. And so that'll go on for a while, and then after a while, after a generation or two, then they will start crying out to God for deliverance, and God sends a deliverer, and that's what we call a judge. And that judge will lead them against the enemies and overcome them. They will worship God, they'll serve God for a while, and then another generation or two, they'll fall away. So this happens over and over and over and over through the book of Judges. So last lesson, we started the story of Samson. That was Judges 13. So they're under your lesson sheet under Judges 13 review. So in this chapter, we don't really get to know Samson yet. We get to know his parents and what happened. So his parents are Manoah, and we don't know his wife's name. Even though she's the heroine of the chapter, God does not give us her name. So an angel of God appears to Manoah's wife. They are a childless couple, and as we brought out last time, that was the worst thing in the world for a woman, because in that culture, in that society, in that time, the worth of a woman was based on her being able to birth children and provide heirs for her husband. So an angel of God appears to her. Through the words that we read, it is believed this was what's called a Christophany, a pre-incarnation appearance of Jesus. And to go through the lesson about that, that's on YouTube if you want to listen to that under Ray of Hope Comanche Church. We don't have time to go into all that tonight, but it's very interesting. Anyway, so the angel appears to the woman and tells her that she's going to have a son, and that he's going to deliver Israel from the Philistines. The Philistines are currently the overwhelming force, the enemy that has them under subjection. And I think they've been under subjection, as I remember from last week, 40 years at this point in time. Let's bring up the two maps that we brought up. First, bring up the one about the 5 city-states of the Philistines, Jesse. Okay, so there's Judah and Israel. On to the right is the Dead Sea. To the blue on the left is the Mediterranean Sea. So the Philistines lived on the west coast of Israel against the Mediterranean Sea. And they had 5 what they call city-states. So they really were not a united nation. It was like back then they had a city that would be basically in and of itself an independent governing body, but then they were in, I guess you'd say in cahoots. They were all in alliance with each other. So you had on the far left bottom Gaza, G-A-Z-A, then Ascalon, then Ashdod, those 3 red dots along the coast. And then if you go towards the right, below the word Philistines, there's one that says Gath, and then one above where it says Philistines, it says Ekron. So those were the 5 city-states of the Philistines. And so throughout the time of the Judges, and then even up into Saul, and really until the time of David, the Israelites never really completely conquered them. They'd have times where they overcome them, and the Philistines would come back. But until the time of David, the Philistines really never were conquered. So we believe that, well, let's go ahead and show the next map. Okay, so this is a modern map. So in the news, you hear about Israel. I think this last week or so, Israel has attacked the West Bank. So the the yellow part is Israel today. The West Bank is the part of Israel that is under Muslim control. And so the green to the right, that's just above the Dead Sea, is called the West Bank. So that's under Muslim control. Now you see this little green area to the left. Gaza is the Philistine city that was there, so that's called the Gaza Strip. So the word Palestinian is I guess you'd call a transliteration of the old word Philistine. So the modern day Palestinians are thought to be descendants of the old Philistines in the Bible times. And so the Philistines are thought to be, they're not Canaanites. They're thought to be originally from the island of Crete, which is out in the Mediterranean, and they were thought to have migrated in Old Testament time on boats to Canaan and landed there on that coast of Israel. But when they got there, they took up worship of the Canaanite gods, and we talked last week how they worshiped the god Dagon and they worshiped the god Beelzebub. When we get to the part of Samson's, the end of his story, when he's in the Philistine temple, and he's blind, but he pushes down the pillars, that's the temple to Dagon. And we showed pictures of those gods last time. Anyway, so the angel of God informs Manoah's wife that her son is to be a Nazirite for life. And so we studied about the Nazirite vow, and so that is actually listed in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, that people could take a Nazirite vow, and most people took it for a temporary period of time. We even know in the New Testament that Paul took it at least once and maybe twice for a period of time. John the Baptist was a kind of a prolonged Nazirite vow guy. But the three things that were required if you took a Nazirite vow, you were separating yourself to God. And the first thing would be you could not drink or eat anything associated with a grapevine. So, and then number two, you couldn't cut your hair. And we believe that was to let other people around you know that you were under a vow to God. And then number three was you couldn't touch dead people or animals. And an interesting thing we talked about last time, I looked up modern day Nazirites. It is not, the Church of the Nazarene is not Nazirite vow, that's separate. But really the only modern day Nazirites I could find was in Jamaica, there's this spiritualist cult called the Rastafarians. And we showed you their flag, which shows the Lion of Judah. And they believe they are descendants of the Queen of Sheba, who visited Solomon. And they believe that Queen of Sheba became pregnant, and basically now they are black Jews. And so they have long hair. They don't cut their hair. You've seen pictures of them with all their dreadlocks. They have very strict diet. It's not exactly the same one as the old Nazirite vow. But their third requirement, which is not touching dead people, their third requirement is you have to smoke marijuana to get close to God. So a little bit off of the Old Testament there. Anyway, okay, so, and a really interesting thing, and this really had nothing to do with the point of the lesson last time. We're trying to learn about being disciples, but also we talked about having God's viewpoint. In other words, as we're disciples, we need to be able to look at people, look at situations, look at cultures, try to see it as God would see it, and not see it as we would as humans. And so kind of a bonus teaching point that we found last time was that when the angel came to Manoah's wife, he said, I want Samson he's to be a Nazirite for life, from the womb. And so as a result, you, Samson's mother, have to take a Nazirite vow now so that when you conceive, he'll be a Nazirite in the womb. So what does that teach us? That teaches that God sees life as beginning at conception. Because if he was to be a Nazirite from the womb, and his mother had to follow that vow, that because his life started then, not at birth. So I think we can infer that very truthfully and take that and try to look at life that way rather than the way culture wants us to look at life. Anyway, so the woman, again, we don't know her name, conceived, delivers a son. She names him Samson. And then the last part of chapter 13 says, the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him. And then the very last observation we made was that I think, this is Jeff speaking, I think he looked normal. I don't know if you ever went to Sight and Sound Theater in Branson and saw the play Samson, big old muscular guy, or maybe in Bible school, or especially with kids, they have coloring pages, and Samson's a great big old, He-Man. Well, when you read the Bible, it says that basically he moved among the Philistines undetected. And then also, when Delilah was speaking to him, she said, her people, the Philistines, had to get out of him, where does your strength come from? It was not obvious. It was not obvious. So I think he looked like a normal person. And his strength was truly from the Lord, not because he had big muscles. Big muscles would be strength from himself. So sometimes we kind of dream things up that maybe not be real scriptural. Okay, so tonight we go to chapter 14 and see what we can learn from this as we continue the story of Samson. Okay, let's look at verse 1 through 4. They're on your lesson sheet, and they'll be on the screen. Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and told his father and mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now go get her for me as my wife. But his father and mother said to him, Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among our people that you must go and take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, Go get her for me, for she's right in my eyes. His father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. Okay, Jesse, bring the map up if you would. Okay, this is a little bit hard to see, but you see Jerusalem there just above the Dead Sea. If you go to the left, it says Zorah, Z-O-R-A-H. So that is where he lived, there with his parents. So Timnah is just to the left, and that is about 7 to 10 miles. So that's something he could walk in, 2 or 3 hours, I guess. The reason it's got Ascalon down here later in the story, you kind of remember where that is. We're going to see why he goes down to Ascalon and then comes back to Timnah during this story. So his family live at Zorah, and it says, verse 4 says, the Philistines are ruling over Israel. Last lesson we talked about how this occurs during the beginnings of what's called the Iron Age. And anytime you have the beginnings of an age, not everybody has the same technology. It's kind of like when cell phones first came out, a lot of us still had landlines, and some of the younger, more advanced people had some cell phones. Well, now we all have cell phones, but that's been several years. So here at the beginning of the Iron Age, the Philistines, as we talked about last time, have figured out how to do metalworking and make farm tools and weapons out of iron. The Israelites did not know how to. And we know that this went on for about 100 years because in 1 Samuel, when Saul and Jonathan and the Israelites are fighting the Philistines, it says only Saul and Jonathan had swords. The rest of them just had weapons made out of sticks and things like that. Spears made out of sticks, swords made out of sticks. So what is it? The Philistines used that as a trump card. Basically, they did not let that technology, that knowledge out, so the Israelites would have to come to them to buy farm tools, like rakes and hoes and things like that, and then they have to go back to the Philistines and get them sharpened, or else they just had to work with wooden tools. So Samson goes to Timnah, and we see that the Philistines are living there. So that is an Israelite city. So that tells us something else, that the Philistines are living among the Israelites. And they're ruling over them. So this is an occupied territory, and the Philistines and the Israelites are almost living side by side. We don't know if there's different neighborhoods with ethnic groups, but we do know they're all in the same city. Now, what's interesting is what's not said here. We mentioned that every other judge, every other deliverer that God brings up to Israel in the book of Judges, it is as a result of Israel crying out in repentance for their sin and asking God to send a deliverer. There's no mention of that here. God is choosing to send a deliverer, but Israel is happy with how they're doing. They have accommodated to culture. They kind of like this Philistine culture because they're not crying out to leave it. So they have accommodated to this idolatrous culture, and they are apparently very comfortable. Okay, at the bottom of I've got a quote here. I've got 2 or 3 quotes from this fellow tonight named Tim Keller. He's probably one of the great theologians, of Christian apologists, Christian teachers of the last 50 years. He just passed away earlier this year. Got lots of books, study books, and I've used some of his stuff in my studies in the past. But he has a quote about this verse here. He says, the people, talking about the Israelites, are virtually unconscious of their enslavement because its nature is of cultural accommodation. The people are virtually unconscious of their enslavement because its nature is that of cultural accommodation. In other words, they are comfortable in culture. You know anybody like that? Are we like that? It's easy to get like that, especially when you have a good culture. Now, if you live in a heathen, horrible culture where there's, terrible people everywhere, but we kind of have a nice little area we live in right here. So it's really easy to get comfortable in culture and just kind of be churchgoers and everything else just kind of like the rest of the world. So that's how the Israelites were. They had become comfortable in this idolatrous culture. So Samson asked his parents to get this Philistine woman for my wife. So back then, arranged marriages were the custom, but they weren't mandated, but it was just a custom. And so the purpose of marriage, as we mentioned, was to produce legitimate offspring, so for inheritance and also to care for elderly parents. There's no Social Security. Social Security came in 1935. This is 3,000 years ago. And so you want to have a lot of kids. I think I mentioned when I was in Nigeria as a medical missionary, I'd talk to women about having tubals, after 4 or 5 kids. Nobody would listen to me. They wanted to have at least 12 because they knew half of them would die before age 5, and they needed at least 5 or 6 to take care of them when they got old. And so that's, third world countries today are much like the ancient world. They depend on their children to take care of them when they get older. So love and attraction are totally not involved in most marriages in that time. But here we have Samson. He's attracted. We immediately see one of his weaknesses. He likes women. He likes women. And you have to assume this is a beautiful Philistine because he sees her from afar and says, go get me that woman for my wife. In other words, you arrange marriage with her, I want her. So the parents say, okay, let's stop and think about this, Samson. You know from God's teaching that God said Israelites are supposed to marry Israelites, not idolatrous people. And Samson's response to that is, get her for me as my wife. So he is not real teachable or coachable. Verse 4. Let's see here. No, I want to say one more thing about verse 4. We just read that. God is not surprised at his weakness. We read this, and you have to remember that God has chosen him as a deliverer, but he knows he's a flawed person. So God is not surprised, just like God is not surprised at my weaknesses. God is not surprised at your weaknesses, because that's the only kind of people that God makes. There's no perfect people in this world. Okay, now verse 5 and 6. Then Samson went down with his father and mother to Timnah, and they came to the vineyards of Timnah. Okay, remember what a Nazarite's supposed to stay away from? And behold, a young lion came toward him roaring. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and although he had nothing in his hand, he tore the lion in pieces as one tears a young goat. But he did not tell his mother or his father what he had done. So it says they're all going together. So I suppose the way I reconcile this is that the mother and father actually had kind of gone ahead of him into Timnah to arrange this marriage, and he was kind of coming behind, and that's when the lion attacked him, and he killed it with his bare hands. But he doesn't tell his parents. So verse 7, then he went down and talked with a woman, and it says she was right in his eyes. So remember, Samson the Nazarite, so if he touches a dead animal or dead person, he's supposed to immediately go to the temple to be cleansed. So does he go to the temple to be cleansed? No, he goes right on the Timnah to visit with his future wife. It says because she was right in his eyes. I read one commentator that he said Samson's problem was he always put his glands before God. He put his glands before God. Well, we know people like that, don't we? You don't have to look at them right now, but you know people like that. Anyway, so we just read she was right in his eyes. Like I said, last week we talked about having the eyes of the Lord, not our eyes. So here, this is another example where the writer is pointing out Samson was not having the eyes of the Lord. There on your lesson sheet, the first verse in the last chapter that we studied, it says, the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. In other words, they didn't have the eyes of the Lord. And then a parallel verse, the last verse in the book of Judges is 21:25 right there. It says, everyone did what was right in his eyes. So when you're doing what is right in your eyes, you're not necessarily doing what is right in God's eyes. So here, Samson wanted that woman because she was right in his eyes. Now, God can work through that situation. I think that's what part of that verse means that we just read, that, here he's working on his sexual appetite, but God can still make this situation work. And so in our lives, even when we make bad choices, not that we need to make bad choices, but when we do make bad choices, God can still make all things work together for good if we love him. And I'll point out during this lesson, Samson, back in Hebrews chapter 11, is called the Heaven's Hall of Fame or Heaven's Hall of Faith. Listed a whole bunch of people in the Old Testament were just tremendously faithful people. Samson's listed. And yet, everything you read about his life is just unbelievable. It's like, this guy's just wild. But he must have been a man of faith under all that wildness and all that selfishness. So, Samson wants a pagan wife because she was right in his eyes. Verse 8 and 9. After some days he returned to take her. He turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, and behold, there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion and honey. He scraped it out with his hands and went on eating as he went. He came to his father and mother and gave some to them, and they ate. But he didn't tell them that he had scraped the honey from the carcass of the lion. And so once again, he's touching a dead animal another time, should go get cleansed, but of course he doesn't. And so he's still doing it his own way. Samson likes to do things his way, not necessarily God's way. Verse 10 and 11. His father went down to the woman, and Samson prepared a feast there for the young women, as the young men used to do. As soon as the people saw him, they brought 30 companions to be with him. So ancient wedding feasts typically were a 7-day feast hosted by the bride. Obviously the groom and his family participated somewhat, but there was really no official marriage ceremony till about 800 years after Christ. So in the ancient world, basically how a couple became married was the two families, it was arranged marriage, they would come to agreement that this is what we want. We want this, our son and your daughter, we agree. And then they would agree on a dowry and a bride price that the groom's parents would pay to the bride's parents. And once that was agreed upon, then they would have a 7-day wedding feast hosted by the bride's family. And then the 7th night, the bride and groom would spend the night together and consummate the marriage, and they were man and wife. So there really was no official preacher in front of the couple wedding type ceremony. All that started about 800. By that time, Europe was pretty much controlled by Catholics. And so the Catholics wanted to control marriage, and so they said if you want to have a legal marriage, you have to have a ceremony in a Catholic church, and you have to both be Catholics. So that forced a lot of people to become Catholics, and that started the church wedding tradition. Not that it's wrong, but certainly it was not started for the right reason. But that kind of carried on through, and that's kind of where we got the beginnings of our wedding ceremony today. Okay, verse 12 and 13. And Samson said to them, Let me now put a riddle to you. If you can, this is the 30 companions. So basically, he didn't bring any friends with him. So the bride's family, said, hey, we got to have some groomsmen. That's part of the tradition is that, the groom has friends, the bride has friends. That's part of this joyous wedding feast. So they got 30 Philistines guys and rounded them up and said, okay, you're Samson's friends for the week. And Samson said to these 30 guys, let me now put a riddle to you. If you can tell me what it is within the 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I'll give you 30 linen garments, 30 changes of clothes. But if you cannot tell me what it is, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. And they said to him, put your riddle out that we may hear it. So he puts the riddle out there, and why would he do this? Well, even back then, grooms were expected to have gifts for their groomsmen, the men, their friends. So here Samson is, I guess he didn't want to come up with 30 gifts, so he figures out a way to try to get them to give 30 gifts to him. It's crazy. So, and I think he's pretty proud of himself for killing that lion, even though really God gave him the strength to do that. So he's planning on receiving 30 sets of clothes. Now back then, we walk in our closet, we got lots of clothes. That's just, clothes are just very disposable. You can go to Goodwill and buy truckloads for $10, it's just amazing, But back then, clothes had to be handmade. Cloth had to be spun and made, and then you had to make it into clothes. I never thought about this till I went to college, and in one of my college classes, there's a Nigerian student sitting next to me, and we kind of started talking in class, and so he said, one time he said, I'm off this afternoon, or you? I said, yeah. He said, why don't you come to my dorm room, and I'll make you tea. Nigeria at that time had just been freed from Britain as a colony, so high tea was a big thing for Nigerians back then. And so I remember walking into his dorm room, and this is pre-microwave area, okay? This is Stone Age. Anyway, so he had a hot plate, to boil the water, to make the tea. But I remember walking in his room, and to the left was the closet, and there was like 4 6-foot rods. And I walked in, I just glanced over there. There was one shirt and one pair of pants. He had on one shirt and one pair of pants. That was the clothes he owned. And you see, historically, in third world countries and in ancient times, people generally had no more than 2 or 3 suits of clothes. They had one they worked in, and they kind of had a special one for going to the temple for worship. They might have had a second one that they worked in. So a set of clothes back then was a big deal. So nowadays we don't think too much of it. But back then it was a huge, huge deal. So the riddle, verse 14, he said to them, out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. And in 3 days they could not solve the riddle. And so basically the riddle had to do with him finding the honey in the lion's carcass, something that none of them would have any idea what he was talking about. So he basically created this riddle so he could get 30 sets of clothes and wouldn't have to give them any gifts. So 3 days into the wedding feast, nobody has a clue. So they come up with a plan to spare themselves from paying for 30 sets of clothes. After all, they thought, hey, we agreed to be groomsmen. We came for the free 7-day feast, get a little gift from the groom, and we're out of here. We're here for a good time, not for a long time. Okay, so verse 15. So on the 4th day, they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband to tell us what the riddle is, lest, this is pretty bad, lest we burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us here to impoverish us? So they say, okay, we're gonna. After 3 days, they couldn't figure it out, so they go to the bride and say, we're going to burn you and your father's house if you don't tell us the riddle. Wow. And Samson's wife wept over him, verse 16. You only hate me, you don't love me. Men, have you ever heard that before? This is called the test of affection. If you really loved me, you would blank. Okay, so that goes back centuries. Okay, it's the wild of the woman. Anyway, so she goes to Samson and begs and pleads and cries, and that doesn't work. Samson says, verse 16 and 17, says, you only hate me, you don't love me, you put a riddle to my people, and you've not told me what it is. And he said to her, behold, I have not even told my father or my mother. So why should I tell you? She wept before him the 7 days that their feast lasted, and on the 7th day he finally told her because she pressed him hard. Then she told the riddle to her people. So I think what happened, to reconcile this, I think probably beginning on day one, as soon as these guys heard the riddle, they knew exactly the person that would know the answer. So, I think on day one they started pressing her, tell us. And by day 4, when she hadn't broken yet, that's when they added the threat. If you don't tell us, we're going to burn you and your house down and your everybody in your father's house. And so Samson pulls the blood is thicker than water routine. I haven't told my mom or dad, why should I tell you? And blood is thicker than water. I looked that phrase up. That phrase has been around for 1,000 years, since 1200. And it basically means family ties are closer than other relations. So that's what Samson is saying. And so she pays him back because as soon as he tells her the riddle, guess what? She tells her people the answer to the riddle because she's not yet married to Samson. So blood is thicker than water on her part too. Verse 18. And the men of the city said to him on the 7th day before the sun went down, what is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? And he said to them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. So Samson's not happy. They tell him the answer to his riddle, and he says, you plowed with my heifer. And the commentators say this is a very disparaging remark in the Hebrew that he makes about his wife. Basically, he's calling her a cow. And so, how many of you women like to be called a cow? Is that very romantic on your wedding feast? This is the 7th day. This is when they're supposed to get together that night. So, I don't think that's going to happen, do we? So, marriage advice to men. Do not refer to your wife as a heifer. Okay, verse 19. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and he went down to Ascalon. Remember the map we just showed? Ascalon, the city of Philistines down closer to the coast. Struck down 30 Philistines of the town and took their spoil, took their garments, and gave the garments to those who told him the riddle. In hot anger, he went back to his father's house. So he knew this marriage wasn't going to happen. So he goes back to Timnah to his father's house. And the companions get their 30 garments from their 30 dead friend or Philistines in Ascalon. And then the very end, it says, and Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his best man. So the groomsman had been appointed to be the best man, he got the wife. So I think it's kind of like, the dad says, well, I've already got the dowry, I've already got the bride price, I've already put out for the 7-day feast, she needs to go somewhere, she's yours, buddy. And back then the bride had no say. Again, this was arranged marriage. So that was the end of that chapter. So what lessons can we learn from this? Number one, God uses flawed people. So we look at Samson, and we see flaws in him immediately. Here's a quote from David Jeremiah, another great teacher. When we read this story, you can't help but ask, why is this story even in the Bible? Though he was a man of faith, as we know from Hebrews 11, and he was used greatly by God, Samson was also a man of great weakness whose failures nearly erased his successes. The Bible does not condone his sinful behavior, but describes it in living color and even shows how God employed Samson's failures to accomplish his will. So what flaws do we see in Samson? So number one, we see that he is impulsive. So impulsive means to act without thinking, to act without reflection, to act without consideration. So that's the first flaw we see in him. The second one, he is unteachable. He's a person who doesn't receive teaching, he doesn't receive wisdom, he doesn't receive coaching from his mentors. Even the greatest athletes that you've heard of, the guys that make millions and millions and millions of dollars, not only do they have team coaches, every one of them has individual coaches. They may have several coaches to coach them on different aspects of their game. Because if they're going to keep making millions of dollars, they have got to be the very best of the very best of the very best. They have to be coachable. They have to accept the fact that, hey, you need to change this. You need to do better on this. This is not good for you. And so, just like athletes, we need to be coachable. We can't go around thinking we know it all, thinking that our stuff don't stink. Because all of us are flawed. And all of us have areas where we can improve. So Samson sees this beautiful Philistine girl and he tells his parents, go get her for me. And this is a culture where the father and the mother are supposed to arrange the marriage, but he tells them what to do. So he's controlled by his senses also. That's his third flaw. And actually the first one and the third one are very close to each other. Being controlled by your senses. He reacts to how he feels about what he sees and wants. So even though his parents attempt to say, hey, you need to marry an Israelite. That's what God wants. He says, no, go get this girl for me. So he's following his impulses. He's following his senses. As we said, it's glands before God. So we look at this guy and we think, man, he just out there. And yet we see that God still uses this unteachable, uncoachable, impulsive, selfish, emotionally immature man, because we know he's found in Hebrews 11 in heaven's hall of faith. So you know what that does for me? That gives me hope. That should give you hope. Because all of us are well aware of our flaws, our imperfections, the fact that, we don't really measure up like we think we should. But God knows all of that. Just like God knew all of Samson's flaws. He wasn't surprised by anything Samson did. But he still used him. So God can still use you. He still uses me in spite of the fact that we're imperfect. In spite of the fact that we are flawed. So to answer David Jeremiah, why is this even in the Bible? It's to give you and me hope. To give us hope that God uses flawed, imperfect people because that's the only kind He makes. God does not make any perfect people. There's an old saying, You know, if you're looking around for the perfect church, well, if you join it, they're going to kick you out because you're not perfect. There is no perfect church. There's no perfect people. That's what this life is about, is seeing how God can work through us as flawed people. The second lesson is His will, His way. Another Tim Keller quote. Actually, I'm going to read the one he did there on the bottom of the first sheet, and then I'll give you the second half of it. It says, the people, talking about the Israelites, are virtually unconscious of their enslavement because its nature is that of cultural accommodation. So they become comfortable in culture. The second half of that quote that I didn't include earlier was, the Israelites do not groan and resist their captors because they have completely adopted and adapted to the social values and the idols of the Philistines. So we mentioned that in this story, the cycle that's missing is the people are not crying out for deliverer. They have been comfortable with the culture of the Philistines. They kind of like it. You know, here these people have, they figured out this iron stuff, and they can go to them and get their tools sharpened. They can buy farm tools. Now, the Philistines won't sell them weapons. But, this is a technologically advanced culture that we're part of now. We kind of like this. Everybody likes to be on the up and up and, be at the cutting edge of everything. And that's where the Israelites found themselves. So they were just kind of happy being ruled by the Philistines. And so a second quote that goes along with this, right below that one, there is no such thing as harmonious coexistence between the church and the world. For where there's no conflict, it is because the world has taken over. Okay, think about what's happened to a lot of Christianity the last few decades. Okay, let's read that again. There is no such thing as a harmonious coexistence between the church and the world, because where there is no conflict between the church and the world is because the world has taken over. It's not because the church has taken over. The church is to be different. We are the church. But if we make friends with the world and our lives are in harmony with the culture of the world, it's because we became like the world. It's not because the world became like us. And so the closer the church gets to the world, the less effect the church will have on the world, because the church is like the world. That make sense? You can't change something when you're like it. It's kind of like salt. Jesus talked in the Sermon on the Mount about salt losing its savor, and we gave a lesson one time about how, they had dirty salt, and so it didn't have any saltiness because it was mixed with the earth, mixed with the world. And so we see this at a church level, and we see this at a personal level, where people say, I'm a Christian, so His way, but I'm going to do it, I'm going to live it out my way. So on a church level, we see churches, Christian churches that say they're Christian, accept the cultural, sexual ethics of the world. We see churches avoid conflict with culture. Basically, they say anything goes. They say that Jesus is not the only way to heaven. They don't talk anymore about sin and judgment. They don't talk about hell. They talk about feel-good messages to make you feel like you're a better person. Let's just talk positive all the time. And so that's His way, His will, but that's our way. That's not His will, His way. That's His will, man's way. So that's on a church level. On a personal level, it can be the same thing. Tracy took me out to drown some minnows, and we were talking about witnessing. And he and Laurie volunteer at the cancer center. I think that's tremendous ministry, because That is people, that is patients who are in crisis. If you have cancer and you're in cancer treatment, you are in crisis. People in crisis are looking for hope. So they have a tremendous way of opportunity to visit with people and try to give them hope through Jesus. So Tracy was telling me, he said, when I started that, I used to ask people trying to open the door, I'd say, "Are you Christian?" He said, I found out real quick that didn't work because everybody said yes. It's like everybody feels they're okay if you just say, "I'm Christian." So he said, I changed what I ask them. He said, now I ask them, "Do you have a personal relationship with Jesus?" He said, that makes them stop and think. It's really, when I say I'm Christian, does that really mean anything deeper than just a label of what my grandmother believed and went to church for? In this area of the country, we have a lot of social Christians or people that identify with that, but really, there's no difference between them and the rest of the world because there is no difference between them and the rest of the world. I don't know if you saw the latest Pew research in America. They had interviewed thousands and thousands of adults and said, "Do you identify as a Christian?" And this year, it is down to 52% of the nation. So here in Oklahoma, everybody's going to say, "Yes, I'm a Christian." But if you go, outside, quote, the Bible Belt, you're going to see a lot of people say, "No, I don't. No, I don't." But let's not talk about them. Let's talk about us. Talk about you. Talk about me. That's what this lesson is for. We can talk about everybody else all we want to, but that doesn't change me or change you. Personal level. Have my values and my beliefs adapted to culture? How am I different from culture? Do people see me different than they see just anybody else that's in this world? Or have I become very comfortable in this culture to where I'm just kind of floating around with everybody else and I go to church on Sunday? Or am I different? Are my words different? The way I talk different? The way I speak of Jesus? The way I have hope? The way I give hope? The way I pray for people? Is that different? So am I trying to do this Christianity thing His will, His way, or is it His will, my way? Here's a good verse. Let's all stand and let's read this together. 1 Peter 2, 9 and 10. Just repeat after me, out loud. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for His own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him who called him out of darkness and into His marvelous light. But once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Put your hand over your heart and say, "I am the church. I am the church." The church is not a building. We come here together. But we are the church. We are not of this world. In John 17, in the Garden of Gethsemane, just stay standing, we're almost done. Jesus was praying, pouring out His heart to God, and He was praying for you and me. He was praying for all His disciples that would ever live. And He says, the world hates them because they are not of this world, just as I am not of this world. Back when we had our little bookstore, I went there one time and bought a keychain with this symbol on it, "Not of this world," to remind me every day, I am not of this world. You can go online and you can buy T-shirts, you can buy bumper stickers. That's the symbol, not of this world. That's you, that's me. We are not of this world. And Jesus said the world will hate us. Why? Because we're not like the world. People don't like things that are different. We're here to stand up for Jesus. We're here to be ambassadors. We're here to be the salt. We're here to be the light. We're here to be the aroma of Christ that draws people to Him. Not in a belligerent way, not in a hard way, but in a soft, kind, loving way. Jesus said, the world will know you are my disciples by the way you love each other. Not by how right you are, not by how loud you are, not by how much you preach, but the way you love. That's how we draw people to Christ. So Samson, for him it was his will, my way, but for us it's got to be his will, his way.